Chapter 16, World War II, Part 3, The War in Asia and the Pacific. The European and American retreat in Asia. The attack on Pearl Harbor was timed by the Japanese to coincide with a general advance into the European colonial territories of Southeast Asia, held by the hard-pressed French, Dutch, and English. On the same day as the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese struck Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Ultimately, their goal was to reach the area of Borneo and Java in the Dutch East Indies to secure for themselves the rich holdings of oil and rubber trees located there. It would be a costly venture. But as they saw things, they had little choice in the matter. They would need these lands in order to maintain their empire. But they seemed to believe that, given the weakness of the British and the Dutch, both of them either under German assault, that is the British, or German occupation, which is the Dutch, the task would be fairly easy, especially if they struck quickly. The fall of Hong Kong. British Hong Kong, being mostly a commercial site and with Japanese troops outnumbering the British Commonwealth troops 4-1 in the contest, fell quickly to the Japanese. The battle beginning on the morning of the 8th of December, and Hong Kong's surrender after the loss of 1,500 troops occurring on Christmas Day, the 25th. Footnote. Actually, it occurred on exactly the same day, 8 hours later, however, as the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but the two events are dated differently because the two sites appear on opposite sides of the international dateline. Many of the British surrendering troops were simply massacred on the spot. Others, some 11,000, were placed in prison camps where many would die of Japanese abuse. The fall of Singapore. The vital British military emplacement at the southern tip of the slender Malayan Peninsula, the island of Singapore, was positioned at the narrows or straits of a vital ocean passage from the South China Sea to waterways leading to the Indian Ocean. Virtually all commerce shipped to and from Europe and East Asia passed under the British guns at Singapore. Thus, it was vital to the Japanese to take Singapore. The Japanese launched their invasion from French Indochina. The Vichy French had allowed the Japanese to build up troops there on December the 8th, hitting first Thailand and then Malaya as they fought their way south towards Singapore. But the British and Commonwealth troops put up a hard fight, but superior Japanese air power pushed the Allied troops back and sank a number of major British ships as well. By the end of January 1942, the Allies were pushed all the way back to the island of Singapore itself. On February 8th, the Japanese were ready for their crossing to the island, but not where the Allies had expected them, and thus where they were thinly arrayed. Within a week, Singapore had fallen. And, as with Hong Kong, the massacre of thousands of surrendered troops and civilians began. Around 130,000 troops were imprisoned, and many would die in prison. However, many, about 30,000 of the imprisoned Indian troops, would come under the influence of Indian nationalist Subhas Bose and be released to join the Indian National Army. And about 7,000 of those would actually join the Japanese in fighting against the British in the Burma campaign and in northern India. The fall of the Dutch East Indies. Fearing that the Dutch would destroy their own oil wells, the Japanese held off their assaults on the Dutch East Indies for a week, then proceeded to attack Dutch airfields, conduct sea battles against the Dutch Navy, and land troops at different places among the many islands making up the colony. The Dutch were unable to focus a particular line of defense against their attacking Japanese, scattered among the islands, and bit by bit found the Japanese taking and holding ground here and there, though the Dutch were able to destroy the oil fields. Likewise, in the naval battles, the Allies did not fare well, and on March the 1st, the Dutch formally gave up. The colony would remain in Japanese hands for the duration of the war, as the action undertaken by the Allies to defeat Japan largely bypassed the region. For the Dutch, to whom the islands of Java and Sumatra had been for 300 years a vital part of their national economy, and even partly their culture, this would present major problems after the war because the Japanese, towards the end of the war when Japan was clearly in trouble, strongly encouraged anti-Dutch nationalism among the local non-Dutch population. The fall of the Philippines. The Philippines, where some 12,000 American troops were located, lay directly at the center of the Japanese path of conquest. Under fierce Japanese attack, the surprised Americans and their Filipino allies retreated into a fairly defensible land position on the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, but found that the Japanese had cut off the surrounding sea routes from which they might draw resupply. Food and ammunition eventually ran out. First at Bataan in April and then finally in early May, after nearly 5 months of hopeless struggle, the Americans and the Filipinos there had to surrender. The Japanese, already contemptuous of the Americans and the Filipinos as fighters, became even more contemptuous of them when they surrendered, forcing some of them to march 60 miles without food or water to a prison camp at Bataan. Thousands of Americans and Filipino troops died along the way, with even more dying soon after arriving at the prison camp. Footnote. Figures vary widely from 2,500 to 10,000 because many of the Filipinos were able to escape along the way, affecting the count. Also, the original number of prisoners is not known with any precision, varying from 60,000 to 80,000 in the best estimates. The Doolittle Raid, April 1942. One thing Americans did do, more for morale-boosting purposes than for military purposes, was an air raid on the 18th of April on Japan, mostly Tokyo. Down, but not out, the Americans wanted to send the Japanese a message that Japan was vulnerable and would pay for its ill-advised attack on America. 16 B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, flew from the aircraft carrier Hornet to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities, more a symbolic hit than a serious military strike. Their bombing was not terribly devastating, but achieved a psychological objective. All the planes crashed, ran out of fuel, before reaching their destinations in China, but crews of 14 of the planes eventually made it back to America. They had planned to land in China in friendly territory after delivering their bombs, but they were forced to start 10 hours earlier than originally planned because of the fleet backing up this mission had encountered, but subsequently sunk, a Japanese packet boat, but probably not before the Japanese crew had given notice to Tokyo of the presence of this American fleet not that far east of Japan. Awareness of this new situation forced the Americans to make the decision to send the bombers off on their mission immediately, 190 miles further from Japan than originally planned. Nonetheless, the 16 bombers successfully bombed Tokyo and 5 other cities before heading on to China, still 13 hours away. They were very low on fuel. One bomber headed for the Soviet Union, and other 15 were forced to crash land or bail out just inside China, short of their designated landing sites and in territory under Japanese occupation. 2 crews were captured by the Japanese and their officers executed. However, local Chinese helped the other crews get to safe territory deeper into China, and the Soviets eventually helped the crew that landed in Russia escape to Iran. The Japanese took revenge on the Chinese villagers who helped the Americans. As many as 250,000 Chinese paid with their lives for that assistance. All airfields in the region were destroyed in order to prevent another such raid on Japan. None was planned, as the raid was subsequently considered almost suicidal. Doolittle initially thought that his raid was a total failure and expected to be court-martialed and stripped of command. But the raid was such a boost to American morale that instead he received the Medal of Honor, a larger air command, and lasting fame. Though Japan suffered relatively little material damage from the bombing, the humiliation was so great, how could the Japanese Defense Force have let this happen, that it pushed the Japanese military to make the decision to perform a counterstrike against the Americans at Midway Island in June, which turned out to be an even bigger disaster for the Japanese military. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May the 4th through the 8th, 1942. In the first few months of 1942, the Japanese had overwhelmed the greatly weakened English and Dutch, seizing all their colonial holdings in Southeast Asia. The French, under Vichy governance, simply turned French Indochina over to the Japanese. By April, the Japanese were ready to seize the Australian colony in New Guinea, in anticipation of attacking and occupying northern Australia itself, and thus sent a fleet to take Port Moresby from the Australians. Possession of this vital port on the southern coast of New Guinea would protect their position in the South Pacific and cut the supply line running from the United States to Australia. But they did not know that the Americans had cracked their military code and were aware of the general nature of this plan, guessing, correctly, that Port Moresby was the intended Japanese target. U.S. Admiral Nimitz thus sent 4 aircraft carriers and accompanying destroyers and cruisers to the area to intercept the unsuspecting Japanese. The first encounter occurred on May the 4th, when planes from the Yorktown attacked Japanese in the process of landing and occupying the island of Tulagi, sinking the Japanese destroyer Kikuzuki and 3 smaller ships and badly damaging 4 others. The Japanese were now aware of the American presence, though not its exact size or location. The 2 fleets met on May the 7th, not exactly by surprise, but without knowledge of the full extent and placement of the opposing side. Initially, both sides found themselves confused about the location and direction of the main body of the opposing fleets. The Japanese misidentified 2 American ships as carriers. Actually, they were a much smaller oiler and a destroyer, and sent their planes to attack and sink them. At the same time, the Americans on the carriers Yorktown and Lexington located the Japanese carriers Shoho and sent their planes to attack and sink the Shoho. The next day, the 2 fleets were well aware of each other's location, and a full air-sea battle ensued between the carriers and their planes. The Japanese carrier Shokaku was badly damaged, though not sunk, in the fight, and had to withdraw from action. Meanwhile, the Japanese sent planes to attack the Yorktown and Lexington, both of which became badly damaged. Then the fighting let up. Both sides were running low on planes and fuel. The Lexington had brought under control damage to the carrier when a fire broke out in her control station and spread quickly, igniting munitions stored aboard the carrier. She had to be abandoned and soon sank. Meanwhile, the Yorktown returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The Japanese claimed a huge victory over the Americans. Their only significant loss was the lighter carrier Shoho, whereas the Americans lost the Lexington, one of its 4 major aircraft carriers. The Japanese thus led themselves to believe that in future confrontations with the Americans, they would destroy the rest of the American carrier fleet. Thus a battle such as the one that subsequently developed at Midway, needed to take place soon, except that the Battle of Midway turned out to be a major Japanese naval disaster. But this was the first time the Japanese had failed to move their seemingly unstoppable military machine forward, thus giving cheer to their enemies. Indeed, this would mark the furthest extent of the Japanese imperial reach in the Pacific, before they were forced slowly into a devastating retreat and ultimately into the total loss of the war. The Battle of Midway, June 1942. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had not achieved its objective, bringing America to its knees, so a second hit was planned, this time on the mid-Pacific island of Midway. The Japanese planned to actually occupy the island, making the California coast possibly vulnerable to Japanese air raids. The Japanese reasoned that the seizing of Midway would finally force America to bow to Japanese power. But, having cracked the Japanese code somewhat, and being aware that the Japanese were planning something big, they tricked the Japanese into revealing their goal. Forewarned that it was Midway, 3 American aircraft carriers, though the Yorktown was itself still badly damaged from an earlier action, positioned themselves to intercept what turned out to be 5 Japanese aircraft carriers and a fleet of battleships and destroyers. Footnote: these aircraft carriers had been out on a training mission when the Pearl Harbor attack occurred, thus leaving America with some form of naval self-defense. Ultimately, the aircraft carriers, including many more which were quickly brought into production, would prove to be a key part of the American success in the Pacific. The Japanese were not aware that the raid was no longer secret and were themselves caught off guard when planes from the American carriers attacked their fleet. Over the next few days, 4th through the 7th of June, Americans sank 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers and a destroyer. But once again, the Yorktown was so badly hit that it sunk during its effort to return to base in Hawaii. This was a clear victory for America, though to keep morale high in Japan, it was announced in Japan as a Japanese victory. This left Japan at the time with only 2 large aircraft carriers, but it also had cost a huge number of lives of experienced Japanese airmen. It was not yet, however, as some would say, the turning point of the war in the Pacific, but the Battle of Midway, plus the naval battle in the Coral Sea, certainly left Japan vulnerable to further American action. The slow advance against the Japanese in the Pacific. Guadalcanal. And that action was soon to follow on the island of Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943, located among the Solomon Islands to the north of the Coral Sea and east of New Guinea. The Battle of Guadalcanal resulting finally in an American victory, which was very costly to the Japanese, and which indeed was a turning point in the war against Japan. But even being the turning point did not mean that the rest of the war in the Pacific against Japan was going to be a downhill battle. To the contrary, though the Japanese were clearly in retreat after Guadalcanal, they fought fiercely for every inch of ground they gave up. The Japanese soldiers clearly demonstrated at Guadalcanal that whenever they would find themselves facing the likelihood of defeat, they would rather conduct a suicidal banzai charge against the American machine guns rather than submit to the grand humiliation of surrender. Their military code of Bushido demanded nothing less. Thus it was that American progress against Japan would be very slow and very bloody over the next few years. Island hopping. The general strategy of the Allies against the Japanese in occupation of the numerous Pacific islands making up the Solomon, Gilbert, Marshall, Mariana, and Caroline Island groups, as well as the Japanese advanced base at Rabaul in New Guinea, was not to attack directly the Rabaul base or attempt to take each island position held by the Japanese one by one, but simply select a few islands that were strategically located in the group and which offered excellent staging ground by sea and by air for their advance deeper into Japanese territory. As the Allies largely held control of the sea and air, Rabaul and the Pacific Islands in the Allies bypassed would find themselves cut off from their home base as the Allies advanced towards Japan, and thus could be brought under full Allied control at a later date. The islands that were selected for Allied takeover were those with airfields, or those which were potential candidates for airfields. But those islands were always the scenes of considerable Japanese resistance, especially as the Japanese tended to dig in deeply, hoping to create an impenetrable line of defense against the advancing Allies. But the Allies bombed and torched, that is with napalm, these defenses as they went. The death toll was tremendously high, especially on the Japanese side, but the Allied losses were also very high. The Southern Pacific Commands. The advance against Japan was something of a multi-pronged effort grouped under several geographic commands. The Southwest Pacific Force. New Guinea. One of these commands, coming up from just offshore from the Dutch New Guinea, just north of Australia, had as its object the retaking of the Philippines from the Japanese. This would require the slow and painful advance westward around the northern side of the huge island of New Guinea, where in January 1943 at Buena Beach the American press was finally allowed to show photographically the American public at home the brutality of the fighting and the terrifying cost in young soldiers' lives of these battles. But as the ultimate goal of this westward push was the Philippines, the rest of New Guinea was left in Japanese hands for the time being. The South Pacific Force. Close by the Southwest Pacific Force was the South Pacific Force, just to the east, coming up at the same time through the rest of the Solomon Islands north of Guadalcanal, Bougainville being chief among these and taking from November 1943 to February of 1944 to secure. The objective for this group also was the Philippines. The Philippines. The Philippines constituting something that General Douglas MacArthur held as a personal objective, for in leaving the Philippines in 1942, he had guaranteed the Filipinos, "I shall return." In October of 1944, he made good on that guarantee, first taking the island of Leyte, but finding the Japanese Navy waiting for the Allies. A huge sea battle resulted, which the Japanese lost decisively. But even then, it would not be until December that Leyte was fully in Allied hands. With much fanfare, General MacArthur came ashore at Leyte Islands, cameras recording the event with a properly dramatic effect. He had finally fulfilled his promise. But the full liberation of the Philippines was yet ahead. From Leyte, the Americans swung around the Philippines' main island of Luzon to land on its northern shore, January of 1945, and then advanced south across the island towards the Philippine capital of Manila. In Manila itself, fierce house-to-house fighting followed until finally in late February, the capital was cleared of the last of the Japanese troops, with much horrifying destruction brought to the city and its people. Once again, the Japanese casualties were also enormously high, as the Japanese seemed willing to fight to the last man standing, rather than to surrender. The Central Pacific Command. Coming in from the east across the Central Pacific was yet another command, under Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. The object of this command was to secure islands close enough to Japan that the mainland, especially the industrial cities of coastal Japan, including the capital Tokyo, could be hit by long-range American bombers. Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, well south of the line of advance, was the first target of this effort, defended bitterly by the Japanese and taking until November of 1943 to finally secure. Footnote. Debate would be ongoing even till today as to whether or not it was absolutely necessary to spill American blood to seize this off-path objective. The Marshall Islands, northwest of the Gilbert Islands, were the next objective, involving heavy fighting to take the islands of Kwajalein and Enewetak in February of 1944. From here, the Americans moved west to the Mariana Islands, which finally put them in bombing range of Japan. The Japanese fiercely but futilely defended themselves against the American advance at the islands of Saipan, June and July of 1944, Tinian, July 1944, and Guam, July-August of 1944. But in securing these Mariana Islands in the summer of 1944, the Americans now held key bases, most notably Guam, from which they could conduct bombing raids on the main Japanese islands. From this point on, the Japanese found themselves as familiar as the Germans as to what it felt like to have the horrors of war inflicted on them rather than on their enemies. The Allied bombing on Japan from this point on would be relentless. Iwo Jima. In mid-February 1945, American Marines went ashore on the island of Iwo Jima, the first truly Japanese island comprising the Japanese island group. Here, Americans would discover what they could expect by way of Japanese resistance, now that they were actually on Japanese soil. It would take almost 6 weeks to break the last of the Japanese resistance on the island. Approximately 90% of the Japanese force of 20,000 was killed or committed suicide in the action. Okinawa. At the beginning of April 1945, a huge armada of 1,400 American ships sent troops ashore on the Japanese island of Okinawa. This large island was so strongly defended in the south that it took 3 months of battle to finally bring it under Allied control. The Japanese killed in action numbered 14 times the Allies killed, a clear indicator of the Japanese resolve to fight. Air and sea attacks on Japanese territory itself. By this point, the Americans were finding themselves closer to the Japanese heartland, and the Japanese Air Force offering little defense against the bombing runs of the Americans on their cities. Tokyo was being hit by intense firebombing, which was turning the Japanese capital into a fiery inferno. Yet the Japanese showed no sign of weakening in their resistance to the advancing Americans. Kamikaze. Footnote. The term is drawn from Japanese history when, in the late 1200s, Japan was spared by a kamikaze, or divine wind, that is, a typhoon, which sunk the ships of the Mongolian invaders threatening Japan, thus sparing the island. What air action that the Japanese did offer at Okinawa was suicidal. A desperate effort of 4,000 young and inexperienced Japanese kamikaze pilots to hurl themselves and their explosives-laden planes at the American ships advancing on their islands. Only a small percentage were able to hit a ship. Nonetheless, the effort certainly unnerved the American sailors, with 30 ships sunk and over 300 others badly damaged by the fanatical kamikaze pilots. Nonetheless, the Japanese naval attack on the American fleet failed to stop the American advance. By now it was clear that the Americans were unstoppable. But it was also clear that the Japanese did not seem willing to give up the fight as long as there were any Japanese still alive to fight. Even the women and youth were being trained in defense tactics. It looked as if the Allies were going to have to go village to village across the entirety of Japan to finally bring the war to Japan to an end. This might take years and millions of casualties to complete. Burma, China, and India. At the very beginning of its offensive in December of 1941, most of Japan and its ally Thailand had attacked British Burma, today's Myanmar, and by April of 1942 had forced the British out of its colony there. The Chinese, meanwhile, were largely holding the line against Japanese expansion in China and were even able to come to the aid of British troops in Burma, which had found itself surrounded by Japanese troops. From their position in Burma, in March of 1944, the Japanese attempted a new offensive against the Allies by attacking the British position in Assam, that is, northeast India, which the Allies had been using as a base to fly supplies over the mountainous hump into China. To counter the Japanese, India itself provided over 3 million troops to the Allied cause, some of the most dedicated soldiers in the Allied cause. But not all the Indians were in agreement with the Allied cause. Indeed, an Indian National Army, the INA, footnote, the INA was made up mostly of Indian troops captured by the Japanese, especially at Singapore, who switched their support to Japan in choosing to join the action against British control of India. The INA was assembled under the leadership of Subhas Bose, dedicated to forcing the British out of India. The INA even went so far as to ally itself with the Japanese in fighting the British, and even fellow Indian troops in neighboring Burma, even planning to cooperate with the Japanese in invading India itself. Given the Japanese treatment of non-Japanese, this was truly a highly risky alliance for the Indian nationalists. They might have been properly termed even fascists. Nonetheless, the offensive proved by June to be a colossal failure for the Japanese and the INA. This effectively ended the Japanese ambitions in the region and killed the momentum of the INA. Gandhi. Even more amazing was the behavior of Mohandas Gandhi, who in 1942, when the British were barely surviving in England under German bombardment, and when the Japanese had the British on the run in Asia, Gandhi decided to once again press for an end to British governance in India. In August of 1942, he announced the start of a Quit India movement designed to drive the hard-pressed British from India through a campaign of civil disobedience which would make India ungovernable for the British. The campaign, however, proved to be a huge failure when the Indians themselves showed little interest in crippling British authority in the midst of the war, a war in which many Indians themselves were serving in the British Imperial Army, over 2.5 million in such active service. Nonetheless, the British arrested and imprisoned Gandhi, which did inspire an Indian reaction finally, keeping him locked up until he was released for health reasons in 1944. But by this time, India was beginning to divide into a number of conflicting political, regional, and religious parties. Pro-British princely states, many Indian officers in the Imperial Army, pro-Soviet communists, and millions of Muslims wanting to break from Gandhi's Hindu India.